My name is Safa Al-Ahmad, and I'm the director of the film Saudi Secret Uprising.
So thank you for coming today. Could you tell us a little bit about the Saudi Secret Uprising film? What is it about and why did you make it?
The film is about the past 3, now almost 4 years of an uprising in the in Saudi Arabia that has barely been covered. And I wanted to make it because within the context of the Arab Spring, or whatever it's called, since 2011, Saudi Arabia is always associated with the counter-revolution, right? Trying to stop other people's revolutions in the Middle East. And I thought it was really important to say it on the record, to have a piece of history, this film, to say that actually that Saudis did try to rise up and did try and were involved in trying to participate in the general revolutionary era in the Arab world. Whether they succeed or not is something else.
Could you give us a little bit more background about what this uprising is? How did it happen? Why did it happen?
The uprising started in 2011, early 2011, just like all the others. And it really kicked off in March when they declared a day of anger in Saudi Arabia, like all the others at the time, right? And it continued, but it was in a specific location. It was mostly in Qatif. And it sustained itself for several years, which has never been never happened before in Saudi history. So that on its own is quite an event. And the reason they came out in the beginning was they called for the release of political prisoners in Saudi Arabia, which is a big issue in the kingdom. There's a lot of political prisoners in the country that yet to be released, yet to be on trial. A lot disappeared. And so with the repression of the state against the protesters, it just escalated like everywhere else. And so many were killed, many were disappeared, many were arrested. But very little was covered on the events there because there were massive events in comparison in Syria and Tunis and Egypt and Yemen. But I thought it was important to tell that story.
So just for our audience, how does the scale of repression compare to what we see in other parts of the Arab world where we've had an Arab Spring?
What do you mean by scale?
Well, for example, we obviously have, for example, what happened in Egypt with the Brotherhood and so on, and then we have, obviously, the most obvious example is what's happened in Syria and even in Bahrain. So in terms of how the Saudi state reacted to the uprising, how does it compare in scale in terms of what they did?
The Saudi government succeeded in isolating the protests in Qatif and put it within a sectarian context, right? So once it was framed as a Shia uprising against Saudi Arabia with their Iranian spies, with all these things together, it made it really hard to build solidarity between other people outside Qatif who weren't Shia, who totally agree, possibly, with the release of political prisoners, political reform, education and jobs, and all the demands that they had, right? So the demands themselves weren't the isolating aspect. It's within the context of the sectarian problems in the Middle East, and specifically in Saudi Arabia, where Shia are a minority within a majority Sunni country. They succeeded quite well in, one, repressing the protests inside Qatif itself and isolating them to the extent where it couldn't spread in other areas. Qatif is quite unique in their ability to organize, to solidify protests and to have huge numbers go out, which is quite unique, unlike in other places inside Saudi Arabia. So as repression goes, Saudi Arabia is quite a repressive government, yet they didn't have to face what other governments did face, like in Syria and in Egypt, in Libya. Libya was massive, right? And in Tunis. So within the scale of protest, it wasn't as popular, as in not as many people went out to protest at the time. But that doesn't mean that protests weren't there.
So what does it mean you're showing your film here this evening, so what does it mean to have your film in a festival like this, and what does it mean to show it in London, of all places?
I mean, to be part of the first BBC Arabic festival, I think is quite an honor, and I'm quite surprised that they haven't done something like this before. They should have. The Saudi Secret Uprising is my first Arabic film to be broadcast. And it's an amazing impact. It's completely different than doing a film in English. I've done other films about the Middle East in English, and they have nearly nothing near the impact that this Saudi film has. It's given me an appreciation to have such an outlet and to have people speak in Arabic and have people from the Arab world be able to see it directly in its original context. So I'm quite honored that I was given the opportunity to make the film with BBC to begin with, to be premiering the film here. It's quite an honor.
You see, because obviously you're showcasing it here in London, and this will mean that people who necessarily don't know very much about Saudi Arabia, what's happened there, will get a chance to see the film. So
I hope
what
so,
kind
yeah.
of interaction do you hope to have with that, in that terms?
I hope that people walk away from watching this film with a different perspective about Saudi Arabia, at least a deeper insight, that something more interesting, more non-stereotypical image of Saudi Arabia can come across. We have a problem that there's limited media freedoms inside Saudi Arabia, and so very little contextual, complex stories get to be told about Saudi Arabia. And so I hope that people, when they come watch it in London, will be able to see that.
So could you tell us a little bit about the kind of, because obviously this film was broadcast on BBC already, or parts of it were. So could you tell us a little bit about the feedback and reaction you've had to this film?
I've had extreme reactions to this film. I've had really positive reaction, and I've had really hateful negative reaction, which to me reflects the realities of the Arab world right now. People who chose to see it in a sectarian context hated it, accused me of supporting terrorism, called me many, many things. But a lot of people really enjoyed the film as well. And so it's the reality of our world right now. I mean, depending how you see your world, you're going to see this film, whether you want to see it in a sectarian perspective, if that's your inclination, yeah. So I've had varying, very extreme reactions, very positive and very negative.
On the, because obviously we're in London and this is in London, so you're showing the film here and you've said you hope it changes people's perception who are not Saudis here in London.
Well, even Saudis, because I mean, a lot of Saudis don't even know that there are protests in Qatif. So for a lot of people who are not actually from the region, it's quite an eye-opener for them as well. Yeah.
But have you had much feedback from them about this film, or because obviously it's already been shown partly on BBC and it's going to obviously be shown later tonight. But from non-Saudis, what kind of reaction have you had from them? Do you feel that your film is so far achieving what you set out to achieve?
I think most of the reaction I got from people who are not Saudi is shock that this was actually happening inside the kingdom, because, as I said, it's Saudi is associated with a different perspective completely in association with the revolutions in the Arab world. So to find out that there actually was a movement inside Saudi Arabia for change and protest was quite shocking to them, and to this extent. So yes, from that perspective, I hope to have achieved something, and hopefully it's a conversation opener to something more in depth about Saudi Arabia, right? Whether you agree with protests or not, whether you agree with the revolutions or not, it's an important conversation to have now in the Middle East about, do we need reform or not? How do we achieve this? The Middle East is facing a lot of really violent resistance, if you want, in both extremes, right? For democracy and to maintain the dictatorships that actually are in the Middle East. And so this is a really important conversation. How do we achieve reform inside Saudi Arabia and the wider Middle East?
You said something that was quite interesting, and that is...
Only one thing?
No, sorry, something I'd like to pick you up on. You said it shocked a lot of people. Now, this is something very interesting, because one of the things that, especially with international news, it's always bad news. And for people who work on Syria, they'll always say we're now suffering from something called like Syria fatigue, where people are not reacting to things anymore. It's not shocking anymore. They sort of broach out.
Yeah, but I think this is a media problem as well. The media focuses on one story and focuses on one angle of that story. So when you think about Syria coverage right now, what do you think? Gunmen with long hair shooting at each other, right? So the problem with how media has covered the Middle East from 2011 onward is, to me, quite problematic because in the beginning it was this black and white, good versus evil, nothing complicated in between, right? And then the story completely changed on the media, so now it's not actually so black and white, right? So you have in Libya, it's turned something quite violent, quite disturbing. In Syria, the same thing. In Iraq, it's the same thing. In Yemen, it's the same thing. And so our problem is that when we deal with stories, we deal with them in black and white, and we have very little patience for nuance. And this is why we're in trouble right now with countries like Syria, with this fatigue on Syria, because we need the space to have a more complex conversation about it, a more humane conversation about it, a more realistic conversation about it, right?
So do you feel, though, that because, so you're saying your piece is more nuanced in that sense, and do you think that's how you achieved that shock you just mentioned?
No, the shock is about the story itself. It's not how I dealt with it in the film, but that the mere fact that there have been protests for the past 3 years in Saudi Arabia and very little coverage has on the story, with all this obsession about protests in the rest of the Middle East, right? In Egypt, I mean, nobody, unless you're hiding under a rock, you would know that, you know, there were protests in Egypt and in Libya and in Syria. But media has generally ignored the Saudi story.
Well, that's interesting because, I mean, I'm still quite interested that there is a shock because, generally speaking, the media perception in this country of Saudi Arabia is never really positive. If you go through the medias here, it's always relatively negative stories. Yeah. Repressive society, women can't
stereotypical
drive,
image of Saudi Arabia.
Stereotypical image.
Yeah.
So I'm interested that you've still managed to shock people, given all that they've been prepared for, in a sense.
No, I mean, the shock comes also, I think, from that problematic stereotypical image of Saudi Arabia, right? Where, what are the usual stories on Saudi Arabia? The royal family, Al-Qaeda terrorism, women can't drive, right? And very little context to all these things. So the shock was, oh, so people were protesting in the street. People were calling for the death of Al Saud. All of that is a shock to them because they're used to a certain bland, fat man, long beard image, right? And that's problematic.
Well, because there's another counter-narrative almost emerging. It's coming more from the academic side, although I still find it quite problematic as well, which is trying to present it in another way. So, for example, in the Foreign Policy magazine, yesterday actually published a story about changing religiosity in Saudi Arabia. And what they were doing is they were basing it on anecdotal evidence partially, but also surveys about where people changed. They said, okay, only 46% of us identify primarily as Muslim now, 80% of us say we're Saudi.
How did they do that? I mean, how do you prove that? I mean,
apparently they did some university did a research and so on, but you see a lot of this kind of stuff coming out about the Arab world.
Yeah, I agree.
Particularly from, I mean, I'm going off topic slightly, but if you look at,
you know, to be an atheist in Saudi Arabia is part of the anti-terrorism thing. You could be considered a terrorist. So I greatly doubt if somebody picked up the phone, called me in Saudi Arabia and say, hey, so do you believe in God? That I would actually answer honestly. I think it's a ridiculous story.
Well, can manage to locate 5% of the population.
I don't believe that.
I tend to
but that's it's quite problematic writing stories about Saudi Arabia like that. They're unsubstantiated. And
well, yeah, because I'm saying that I see quite a bit of this research coming on. I see one.
I don't know if I call it research.
Well, I hear one Cole saying something very similar when he talks about, he has a new book about the Arab Spring, and he's talking about nationalistic youth in Cairo. I get the impression he talked to some people, nationalistic youth in Cairo, and now he says this is completely, you know, a secular progressive revolution. They're not really devout, as he put it. So we're starting to see a sort of counter-narrative emerging on one side, but that to me seems almost as problematic as the mainstream narrative. Do you sort of see this vicious cycle going around?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it's a vicious cycle either. I think what he meant within the context of Egypt is because of the experience of the Muslim Brotherhood and how badly they failed in the very short time they were actually in power. I think within the Saudi context, a lot of people are doing a lot of soul searching, especially after ISIS and all the Saudis that are joining ISIS. It's like, why are they joining ISIS? Why have they become so brutal? And so I think there is an internal conversation right now inside Saudi Arabia about where have we gone wrong that our youth are choosing to go join an organization that this brutal. and so I don't think it's a questioning of religion per se, but how our society and our educational system and our government has played a role in encouraging people like that, and especially the youth in Saudi Arabia, to join a movement like that. That is obviously quite extreme. But I mean, Saudi Arabia is not alien to extreme thought. It's just going that step further. So yes, I mean, this conversation, especially with like the religious police inside Saudi Arabia and the recent incident with the British guy who was attacked. So that has opened up a lot of soul searching on this topic.
So getting back to...
I don't think, let me just put it clearly, religion is not the problem in the Middle East. It's not about Islam. It's about something much deeper than that. I mean, you can blame any religion for extremism, but it's how politics likes to use religion to justify brutality. So it could be any other religion in the Middle East, and we would still be in the same mess because of dictatorships, because of the brutality, because of the inability to reform, to accept that people want more freedoms. So call it what you want. It's not about religion. It's about politics.
So because it's interesting, because I was actually going to ask you now, so because given we're in London and so on, what effect do you think what's happening in Saudi Arabia can have for us here? Because obviously you even mentioned ISIS, which obviously does have an implication here. We have boys from here going over there.
Yes.
But also, I mean, in Qatif, it's been framed as a mini Shia uprising, and there is a rising sectarian politic in the Middle East. And I've not actually heard anyone talking about it here, but when, for example, ISIS took over in parts of Iraq, there were actual interventions in the Shia mosques here to stop young Shia men from here going over to fight.
Yeah, to fight against ISIS.
Fight against ISIS. So what kind of implications do you think what's happening in Saudi Arabia can have here, in this country?
Yeah. I don't think the implications are like that, especially for the Shia, at least. It's not come to that extent. The problem that we have with England, for example, to be more specific, is the continuous military support of dictatorships in the Middle East. Like the UK stance on Bahrain, for example, is shameful. And the same thing with Saudi Arabia. So I don't think the impact is what you're talking about with ISIS. It's nothing of the sort. The problem is political.
But won't there be implications if Britain is seen to be allying itself, or is allying itself so closely with a repressive regime like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah. England has always supported Saudi Arabia's regime. I mean, nothing has changed in decades. I don't see it changing.
But the added dynamic here is the fact that they've done it for decades, but unlike before, they've never had as diverse a population as it currently has. Because, I mean, 50 years ago, if they'd been supporting radical movements, let's say, elsewhere, Al-Qaeda wouldn't have been a problem because they didn't necessarily have a large population of people from those backgrounds.
You mean the blowback wouldn't have been as well? Yeah, I don't think there would be blowback from Saudi Arabia on the UK. The Shia population is quite small. The blowback that you're having now is with ISIS, and it's not necessarily specifically Saudi Arabia. It's your own internal politics.
On that, are you finding there is much of a market or demand for that in this city? Because you're talking about changing the stereotypical image. Mm-hmm. Have you found much of an audience of people willing to watch things like that?
I think there is. I think there's a huge audience and a huge interest. And I think especially now with 2011, the paradigm shift and the image of the Arabs, I think, has changed a lot. And to the better, I think, in a way. But it's forced people outside the Arab world to look at them differently. There was this glimmer of hope in 2011 that was really an amazing moment. That has turned quite sour in many different countries in the Arab world. To me, change takes a long time. And we shouldn't be short-sighted just because things are really, really bad right now, that they're not moving to a better place where people can't think that they can continue to be a dictatorship and survive it. Right? People want change, and they will find ways to do it. Whether that change is better, whether that change right now is to the better or worse depends on us, and we need to own that. And hopefully these documentaries that are made will reflect that.
Okay, so just I've got two more questions. So there's one I wanted to ask you, which was since making the film, since you've made the film, has there been much change in what's happened in Qatar? What's happened since the film, basically?
A lot of death penalties, a lot more arrests. It's quieted down for a bit after I finished the film, but now after Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, who was quite vocal in his support of the protests, got a death sentence, and like maybe a week ago, things have started off again, and massive protests again. So there's an ebb and flow to the protests in Saudi Arabia. They will never end. They might stop for a bit and restart again. But that's because there was no real reform for them. What was the reason for them to come out in the first place still continue.
Okay, and I'm wondering about it personally for you. Since making this film, has this meant you have greater restrictions or affected the way you can work if you were to go to Saudi Arabia now?
I cannot go back to Saudi Arabia, no.
What would be is it that you're in danger of arrest or what?
I've been told off the record not to go back. It's not safe at the moment, so.